Welcome back to another episode of the Faith Informing Podcast, the podcast that talks about what informs our faith and how our faith forms us. In this episode, I have the joy of interviewing Richard Mouw about his lifelong work on convicted civility and how his theology and life experiences have given him the tools necessary to engage people he disagrees with in love and grace. If you've listened to the past episodes of the Faith Informing Podcast, then you've heard Rich's name come up before. I've interviewed 3 of his students, including Jessica Joustra, Corey Wilson, and Justin Bailey. If you haven't had a chance to listen to those episodes, then be sure to check those out. Rich needs no introduction, but he is most well known as the former president of Fuller Seminary. He served as president of Fuller Seminary for 2 decades and has a background teaching philosophy and theology. His PhD is from the University of Chicago, and he has published 17 books, including Uncommon Decency, Christian Civility in an Uncivil World. So stay tuned for another great episode of the Faith Informing Podcast. So tell me a little bit about yourself. Where did you grow up? Where did life start for you?
New Jersey.
Okay.
My dad was a pastor in the RCA, and so I was, but really I had been more of a fundamentalist. I mean, he got converted at a mission in Paterson, New Jersey, and but then he married my mother, who was raised in the First Holland Reformed Church of Passaic, New Jersey. And he eventually got around to becoming an RCA pastor.
So when you say fundamentalist, you mean like, was he kind of more in the dispensationalist world?
Yeah. When he got converted, he immediately started studying the Schofield Bible. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, which had a massive influence.
Oh, man, yeah.
And especially during that time. I mean, that was the big boom of it.
That's right, yes. Yeah, so, we were, Bible clubs, Youth for Christ, that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
When I went to college, I went to Orange City, Northwestern College in Orange City. And then I went to Western for a couple of years. And then I went into grad school in philosophy. But when I was in Orange City, I attended the Christian Reformed Church. There was a guy named John Hulse who became the president of Dort College. And he preached whole sermon series on the Canons of Dort and that kind of thing, and really won me over. So I became very much into that world. Yeah. And then,
wait, you were won over to the Reformed faith through the Canons of Dort?
Yeah, I love the Canons of Dort, actually.
I love that. That's it. That's just not usually the the confession that gets people in. Maybe they like the Heidelberg Catechism where it talks about our only comfort, but you were right up there in Tulip.
Yep. I served for 5 years. I was chair of the Synodical Committee on Race Relations when I was at Calvin. And we would have these meetings of African American, Native American, Hispanic mainly, and some Asian members of the CRC. And I had a new Hispanic member from California, and I asked him to open in prayer in his first meeting. And he prayed and he said, "Lord, I'm so grateful to be a part of the Christian Reformed Church, and thank you for leading me here. Of course, Lord, that I don't agree with a lot of the stuff. And I really hate the Canons of Dort." But he said, "I told my pastor that," and he said, "That's not a problem. I don't like them either." But no, it's...
Why do you think that is? Why do you think the Canons of Dort have people can have such a strong reaction to them?
Yeah. I find, obviously, they concentrate on election and predestination.
Hmm.
They did not go the hard line route on reprobation. They kind of skipped over that. And there's some wonderful things in there. I mean, that the elect in due time and in various degrees will experience the godly fruits of election, a godly sorrow for sin, a filial love of Christ, a hungering and thirsting after righteousness. I mean, there's some good stuff there. And then that wonderful thing that God doesn't treat us like blocks of wood or stones, but he woos us. I mean, there's the language of wooing and like so. But for some reason, it got used it almost got politicized by the right wing,
Hmm.
So it got a bad reputation from the way it got used. And but
Yeah, it's known more by that reputation rather than, I don't think many people actually read it. And it's too bad because I think there is a lot of gems in there.
yeah,
But I like what you said, that God doesn't treat us like blocks of wood. Um, that line in that confession, I think gets at an overarching reform theme that says, yes, God is sovereign over all, but he gives us this human agency in his grace that allows us he condescends to us in this way.
that's
It's
right.
amazing.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah.
Mhm.
And I mean, I love the other confessions too, but I'm not about ready to reject the canons. In fact, I gave in Dordrecht, I gave the keynote address for the anniversary of the canons last there. And we had some good discussions there. I mean,
I saw that you had done an interview with Kristen Tippett on Being
yeah,
about,
right.
I don't know, 13 years ago or so
Yeah,
now. But and you talked about this convicted civility. And
yeah,
she said, she kind of teed you up and said, we're living in such a time of um that we're at each other's throats a bit, where it's polarized, and we're not very good at being civil with one another. And now, 13 years later, I'm like, I I don't think much has changed. I mean,
no, no,
it's worse perhaps. So I think your notion of convicted civility is still a really important topic.
mhm.
Um, so where did the notion of convicted civility start for you?
You mean where did I pick it up?
Or yeah, where did you pick it up, and why was it important? Why did it impact you?
Well, I've been working a lot on, I do a lot of sort of my scholarship as a philosopher. I did a lot of work in political thought. Everyone, John Locke and Hobbes and some Karl Marx and that kind of thing.
Hmm.
Um, and I was very interested in obviously in political life and the sense in which uh, politics isn't bad. I mean, for Aristotle, we don't really grow up until we learn to be citizens and have a kind of love for our fellow citizens and a love for the city, for the civitas. And of course, the word civility comes from city, which civitas. And so to be a mature human being, basically it's the Aristotelian idea, to be a mature human being is to learn to flourish in the city. And we first learn human relationships, bonding with other people as babies, bonding with mommy and daddy, and then and other members of the family. As we grow older, we have friends who aren't kinfolk, and so friendships with people with whom we have common interests But Aristotle said, we don't really grow up, we don't really mature until we develop the virtues associated with citizenship, which means that we end up feeling bonded to other people simply on the basis of our shared humanity.
Mm.
So we enter into the public square and we see people who look different than us, they act different than us, they have different values, but we honor them as fellow citizens, not because we know them and like them in a kind of intense way, but because we honor the shared humanity. And that idea of a shared humanity is very important. Well, then when you as a Christian begin thinking about those themes, we have the image of God. We have that sense of bonding with people from every tribe and tongue and nation who are our fellow Christians, but we've never met them, or we don't know too much about them. And John Calvin keeps reminding us, that the most remote human being whom we never see or never meet, nonetheless is our neighbor, because that person is created in the image of God, and we need to see them as God sees them. So all of that works into the civility thing for me to develop it as a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And when Marty says, people have strong convictions often aren't very civil, and people who are civil don't often have very strong convictions. But among those strong convictions are convictions that lead to civility, like the image of God, and that kind of thing. So, it all
That's
came together nicely for me, in terms of a theology of civility growing out of my philosophical studies.
that's amazing. I want to pick up on what you said about Aristotle and also the image of God. But let's start with the Aristotle. I I don't think I've heard that before, that connection with civility and city.
Yeah,
Because that's really interesting, because sometimes as Christians, and this from, kind of maybe the fundamentalist impulse to escape, to get away from the world, so to speak. There can be an impulse, and I see it even in progressive circles, all kinds of Christian circles. There's an impulse to, like, oh, if only we could live a more agrarian lifestyle,
yeah,
be more in touch with creation, which of course is good, but it also takes you away to some degree from people.
yeah,
And when you're surrounded by people, you're forced to engage them. And so is there a sense there that, like, this connection with the city, and I think of city as like crowded or lots of things going on, um, is that where your civility is tested, so to speak?
yeah. I think so. It definitely is tested, because I think we're created to be public selves. Um, And really, it's the public square that Aristotle, the place where we encounter the stranger, we encounter uh, fellow citizens who are not friends in that narrow sense of. And I do think that the kind of escape from public selfhood that you're getting at in your comments has a lot to do with in our Christian world of a kind of a piety of interpersonal relationships.
Hmm.
So there's all this wonderful stuff about Jesus. He reaches out to the Samaritan woman, the woman who touches the hem of his garment, the Roman centurion whose daughter is dying, Zacchaeus and all that stuff. And that's good stuff. But there's a wonderful verse in the Gospels that goes like this: and seeing the crowds, he had compassion upon them, for they were sheep without a shepherd. And there's a sense in which Jesus also cared about crowds. He fed 5,000 people. He didn't know each of them by name as a human savior, but he cared about hunger. So anyway, I do think that we have often failed to appreciate the corporate, collective, communal, public aspects of the gospel, which is clearly there in the Hebrew Bible,
Mm-hmm.
and the ways in which God cares about justice and wants God's own people to be a light to the nations, and that wonderful stuff in Jeremiah where God's people are brought into captivity in Babylon, a wicked pagan city. And how are we going to handle this? I mean, we don't have a temple. We don't have godly rulers. They don't even know about the Sinai law. How are we going to handle this? And then Jeremiah comes to them and he says, well, here's the deal. Plant gardens and eat. That's something permanent about it. We're going to be here a while. So grow crops and marry off your sons and daughters and multiply in the land, And then this, and pray for the rulers of the city, and then seek the shalom of the city in which I placed you in exile, because in its shalom you will find your shalom. There's some sense in which flourishing in public life and promoting the flourishing of others, even pagan people in Babylon, is an important mandate from God. And you get that repeated in the New Testament, First Peter, for example, where he says, I beseech you as aliens and exiles, kind of a parallel to that Babylon theme, to do good works among the Gentiles, so that they may see your good works and glorify God on the day of visitation, And so God is calling us, and we often, and those are passages we haven't paid a lot of attention to, what's government for? Well, Romans 13, ordained of God. But forgetting about the fact that God ordains governments, as Romans 13 says, to punish those who do evil and to reward those who do good, And so it isn't just do whatever the government wants you to do, but we have to be doing good. And we have to promote the welfare of the city. We have to do good works among the Gentiles, And that's the stuff that I've kind of emphasized in my own work. And I think Abraham Kuyper and Herman Bavinck clearly understood that, And that's why it's such a rich tradition that we have there.
Yeah, it connects a lot to this idea of coram Deo, of living before the face of God, where a lot of people, like you said, they live before the face of God, but it's more individualistic, more pietistic, more like, I wake up today and I need to live as if God is right here, so I better pray, I better read my Bible, I better not give in to some grave sin of some not, do something scandalous. But there's this other sense where living before the face of God is, well, how do I live before the face of God as I engage the community He's placed me in?
That's right. And this is where I think it's so important that when we go into the voting booth, we're voting before the face of God. When you're at a Giants game, you're cheering before the face of God. When you're an artist, you're doing your work before the face of God. If you work in a bank, you're doing that before the face of God. So there's that sense that God requires us to be aware of His rule, of His commands in every area of life, every square inch of creation. Belongs to Jesus Christ, and that means that wherever we are, it's sacred ground. It's holy stuff,
Yeah, I was just this last Sunday, I preached um, from First Kings when Solomon has built the temple and the glory of God descends in a cloud in the temple.
Yeah.
And I made the connection in my sermon to that the glory of God has descended in your bodies as the temple of the Holy Spirit.
Right. That's right.
And I think it's this connection that like, yeah, we don't realize, I think, yeah, for many of us, we live lives without the awareness that it's far more spiritual than we think, than we give it credit for.
That's right. Yeah. Hey, good stuff. Good preaching.
Well, thank you. Hopefully, someone took that home with them. But like, yeah, there's this real reality that if I'm a Christian, if the Spirit lives within me, I'm gonna go around and seek to do the Spirit's bidding. If Jeremiah were here today, um, he might not say to people in my neighborhood or your neighborhood, you need to plant a garden, although maybe he would. But maybe he would say, join the library
Yeah.
board
Yeah.
or volunteer at your children's school
Yeah.
or all of these ways that we're invited into public life.
Yeah.
But it can be easy to say no to those opportunities as Christians because we kind of think we can think, well, I mean, what difference will that make for God's kingdom?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the fact is, it makes a difference because God has promised that he will count it as contributing to the coming of his kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not up to us to always try to figure out how it happens, that there's something about even our simplest deeds done in faithfulness to his will.
Mm-hmm.
I had an embarrassing experience one time. I was at a meeting and I had gotten to know the very well-known sociologist Peter Berger, who was really a faithful Lutheran in his thinking. And we were sitting around talking, and I was in my sort of political activist stage. I mean, I'm still an activist, but really into some of the more radical stuff, And I made the comment that every one of us is called to promote justice and peace in the world, And that if we're not doing that, we're not doing the will of God.
Mm.
And Peter had a kind of sarcastic streak in him. And he said, Mouw, let me tell you about my godly aunt, who's about 90 years old. And she's in a retirement village. And he said she has real problems with bladder control. And he said she worries every morning about going to lunch in the cafeteria, whether she's going to be able to maintain control of her bladder. And so she prays that God would give her control. And she goes to the cafeteria line, trusting God to help her not embarrass herself, by the lack of control of her bladder. Now, for her, that is the biggest act of faith every day, is to go to lunch. Now, what are you going to say to her? Hey, you got to be working for justice and peace in the world, And that was a profound insight to me that we each are called to exercise faith in the difficult places of our lives. And some of it obviously has to do with justice and peace. But for some people, it's just going to lunch. The great act of faith of going to lunch,
Yeah.
And well, you know that from working in a retirement place.
Yes, I do. I literally can think of someone right now that was, they were dealing with exactly that situation.
Yeah. You know,
Strikes me that that's a really gracious posture because, sometimes as Christians who care about justice, who care about promoting um, good common life, it can be a demand. It can be quite demanding, right? It can be like, you're not, we can look at, it can be easy to look at another Christian and be like, you're not doing enough.
that's right.
But yes, you're right. There's this like gracious side of like, God wants us to live faithfully before him. And given whatever is going on in your life, that's going to look really different compared to the next person.
That's right. That's right. Exactly. And it may very well be that, a lot of our whole theology of work, that we've got to do our work to the glory of God. And we often emphasize bank presidents and NFL coaches.
Yeah.
But, a theology of work also has to apply to the person who just meets people at the bank who are coming in to withdraw money, And it may very well be that for them, simply smiling at them and not treating them as just customers who come and go, but just showing kindness may very well be the equivalent of doing justice as a bank president, Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's so important. It kind of I think it connects to your what you were saying about what it means to be the image of God, that we're deeply connected to one another because we are collectively the image of God. Can you
Yeah.
talk a little bit about um you write about this at times, but what do you mean when you say like the image of God is not just an individual thing, but it's a collective thing?
Yeah. It was a great thing involving that God creates human beings, Adam and Eve, in his own image. But he meant that image to develop also. And, God created two individual human beings, but he told them to be fruitful and multiply. And God anticipated in the creation that there would be large communities of people. And then we need to think about what the image of God means in that collective sense as well. And Bavinck has this wonderful idea that the collective image develops through history, and we'll never see the full glory of the image of God until the gathering in of the nations,
Mm-hmm.
And that it may very well be that there are aspects of the image that are developed in Nigerian culture and other aspects in Bolivian culture and other aspects in Northern California, So that in a sense, the gathering in of the kingdom at the end, the gathering in of the tribes and nations, the glory of the nations will enter into the holy city, will be the gathering in of the fullness of the image of God.
Mm.
And there's something wonderful about that because we can respect, so-called primitive cultures, sort of Sioux Indian tribes. They were in their own ways, and their weaving and in their hunting and their gathering and their growing and their family relations were contributing to the development of the image of God, and that will be revealed in the end time. We'll see their glory being gathered, There's something wonderful about that, I think, And
That really opens up a mystery within the faith.
Yeah.
Because I think, I've heard many people talk about what is the image of God. And I've, you know, sometimes it can be talked about in real simplistic terms.
Yeah.
Um, but the way you're talking about it, the way Bavinck writes about it, it's a great mystery that we can explore. Like, you should be excited to go and meet all your neighbors because you're going to see something new about God through them.
Yeah.
And it's also acknowledging you're not going to know everything because there's no way you'll ever know everyone.
Mhm.
And there's something like that's both humbling, thinking about the image of God in those terms, and exciting all at the same time that we're part of something, far greater than we really realize.
Mhm. Yep. And that we also think of what our redemption does with regard to the image that we have, that within the Christian community, we need to be seeing our fellow Christians of different tribes and tongues and nations developing aspects of the glory of the image of God in ways that we desperately need to honor and learn about and pray about as well. I had this wonderful experience, rare experience, about 12 years ago. I went to North Korea. There's a Christian Reformed layman named Korean Christian Reformed elder named Jung Chang, who is the owner of Forever 21.
Oh, yes. Okay, I've heard about him. Mm-hmm.
And he he's just a terrific guy, a wonderful Christian. And he was contacted, he has a South Korean background and American passport, but he was contacted by the North Korean government because they're trying to develop their market system and also wanted to develop the tourist trade. That was going to be their next big thing. And they wondered whether he would be willing to help them establish an international hotel in Pyongyang. He negotiated for a while, but eventually gave it up. He didn't get along all that well with them. But during the time that he was having positive relations with them, he found out that there had been a landslide in the northern part of North Korea where 4 villages had been really devastated. One village just got completely covered over and all the people died, but their crops got ruined in these villages. And there was a tremendous hunger. Children were dying. So he asked if he could deliver many tons of food, rice, corn oil, corn flour to bake things. And the North Korean government agreed, but he said, I've got to come and see it, make sure that it gets, he wanted it to go to their military, he wanted to actually go to those villages.
Sure.
So they agreed that he could come and bring a small group of people with him, and he invited me to go with him, along with a couple of Fuller grads who were Korean Fuller grads too, who could speak Korean. And we went, and it was great experience. So we were driven 10 hours north of Pyongyang. We saw a lot of the countryside with a lot of small villages. And then we met the people in those villages and were welcomed by them. But over the weekend, back in Pyongyang, the government minders, and they watched us very carefully, but we're going to take you to church. Well, where are we going to go to church? Well, we found out they have 4 legally permitted churches in the Pyongyang area. And we went to an old Presbyterian church that had been built by Presbyterian missionaries in the early part of the 20th century. And it wasn't just a show put on for us, because there were German and Canadian business people and government people, I mean, ambassador type people, who assured us that they came every week for this service. And as we walked into the service, the choir, the North Korean choir, in old robes from the Presbyterian days, were singing "Jesus Paid It All" in Korean.
Wow.
And it was very, very moving. And then at a certain point, the choir sang "What a Friend We Have in Jesus" in Korean, and all the verses. And I've got a picture of this that I took. The front row, there were some women, young women, and one of them in the front row, when they sang that verse in Korean that goes, "Are we weak and heavy laden with a load of care? Jesus knows our every weakness. Take it to the Lord in prayer." So she started to cry, tears streaming down her face about Jesus, And all of a sudden it hit me. I'm not here as a tourist. This is a family gathering,
Mm-hmm.
This is a fellow citizen in the kingdom of Jesus Christ. And that had a profound influence on me. I'm seeing someone that not many of my fellow Christians get an opportunity to see, but a woman living under a persecuting, oppressive government who loves Jesus and takes it to the Lord in prayer. And that someday she will be in the holy city, bringing the glory of her own experiences. And who knows what it is? I mean, relational or financial or whatever. But she's doing something that's so important for the kingdom of Jesus Christ, and it will be revealed to have contributed to the work of the kingdom, her faithfulness. I like the woman going to lunch, in the retirement home.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it strikes me as, her name probably will never be written down in a book on this earth.
No.
And her name will not be known on the news or social media, but her name's written in the book of life. And that's what brings, I mean, that story is just amazing. It brings so much meaning to what is going on when we come to Christ.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And to recognize that we need those stories, we need those experiences, because they put a face, as it were, on the ways in which people living as Christians under very different circumstances than mine are living in obedience to the kingdom. There was a professor at Calvin College when I was there, Martin Radius, a wonderful guy. And he had just retired. And when I decided to move to Fuller Seminary from teaching in the philosophy department at Calvin, I'll never forget it. You'll appreciate this from your own experience. He said, when you go out there to Fuller, I hope you'll teach students how to preach in retirement villages.
Oh, really?
He said, I got to tell you about the last couple of weeks. He said, we had a young preacher come last Sunday, and his whole sermon was about dare to be a Daniel and stand up for the cause of the gospel. And he said, the whole first row was wheelchairs.
Dare to be a Daniel. Oh, that is hilarious.
And he said, and they'll come in and they'll tell us we got to stand up for the truth, And And he said, this whole business of contextualizing the gospel, you got to contextualize it for retired people.
Mm-hmm.
They
That's
have,
right.
what does it mean to live in faithfulness to the gospel in a retirement home, in the Holland home in Grand Rapids, Michigan? And
Yeah, one of the things I would often say when I was working in that setting, I one of the felt needs that I encountered amongst residents of a retirement home was purposeless. Like they felt purposeless, some residents. Like, what am I supposed to do? Because many of them lived such active lives.
yeah,
And then due to um, physical ailments, disabilities setting in, sometimes dementia, whatever it may be, their world, grew a little, it got smaller and they were limited in what they could do. And I forget who it was that told me this, but I held on to it and I always would often share it with especially Christian residents that regardless of whether you're 7 or 97, you're a disciple of Jesus Christ. And that never changes, that you're always following Jesus, even here in this small room that you can't necessarily leave on a regular basis. There's a sense your identity is still a disciple. And how might that change your day to day, or how might that help your imagination for today?
right.
Um, yeah, it was interesting preaching in that setting. I was there for 5 years, preaching on a regular basis, leading Bible studies um, and what I found was as a preacher, I was challenged to think about the call to action portion of the sermon.
Yeah,
You preach in a church where, like where I am today, I can preach a call to action that, is very practical. Dare to be a Daniel. um, but there, I had to think differently about it. I had to imagine what their lives, what they were gonna, as they walked out of chapel, what were they going to be doing? And a lot of it was, engaging their neighbors within the community.
that's
A
right.
lot of it was um, getting phone calls from their children.
Yeah,
Um, and then you take it another level, and then I would do chapel services in our memory care unit where we were serving residents with dementia. And I had to think about it in even different there. I had to think about it. What matters most is right now, this present moment. So how do I talk about the scriptures that invites them into this present moment of engaging God?
right, right.
Um, so you're absolutely right. You got to contextualize.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
right.
It's not easy, but it's worth it.
Yep.
Yeah. So, um, as you think about the church today, and we're in quite we have an election coming up, obviously. Um, we're we're very polarized. We're struggling. I would say the church as a whole is coming out of COVID. Um, in from your perspective, what do you see as, you're still connected to Fuller and um you have a pretty broad view of the Christian world because of your background and your experiences. Um, are there things that you could share for our listeners that you're excited about in in the church? Maybe not, doesn't necessarily have to be in the American setting, but around the world, or just stories that are encouraging you about the work of the gospel these days.
Yeah. Well, I mean, for one thing, I am very excited about the younger generation
Hmm.
of Christian. I mean, when you know about the Asbury revival, where they went.
Yeah.
And before all that happened, people were talking about we're going to lose this next generation of young people. They're not as interested in the faith, And then all of a sudden, God says, well, wait a minute, I'm going to show you something. And young people, 20, 18, 20, 22 years old, were sitting in chapels for weeks at a time, praying and singing hymns and confessing sin and praising God, And it's like the whole message there that I didn't hear a lot of celebration of, but the message was, hey, God hasn't given up on this generation, If you're in youth ministry or you're in campus ministry, that's got to be encouraging to you. That there are spiritual yearnings that can be reawakened by the grace of God. And I'm convinced that God hasn't given up on this generation and that they're capable of good things. I was at the Calvin University now, campus last spring. And I spoke to a political science class, and I found out some of the stories of those wonderful students who had just, they weren't talking left wing or right wing stuff. They really wanted to think Christianly about political issues. And the professor introduced me afterward to a young woman in the class who lived locally in one of the suburbs of Grand Rapids. And the school board, these horrible stories, the school board there was terribly divided between left and right. And people on the right were trying to ban books. Mm-hmm. And people on the left were trying to keep them from banning books. And this young woman, about 19 years old, ran for the school board as a unity candidate in order to get people talking to each other better than they were yelling at each other in the school board meetings. And she won.
Oh, my.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
Her whole mission was to get left and right on that school board, trying to understand each other better, And I'm convinced that that's not a rare kind of example. That there sometimes it's just trying to get Uncle Harry to talk to your mother at Thanksgiving dinner,
Mm-hmm.
But I do think, I had a Fuller student come to me, and she said, please pray for me. I'm going home for Thanksgiving. I'm facing a very difficult situation, and I'm trying to deal with it right now. She said, I've got a lesbian sister who's in a committed relationship. And my parents have told her that she can come home for Thanksgiving dinner, but she can't bring her partner with her. And this young woman says, I hold to the same kind of biblical views as you do, but I love my sister. And I'd be glad to spend a meal with her partner, And yet it's so hard. I've got to try to help this conversation between my parents and my sister. And we talked about it and prayed about it. And I told her I would continue to pray for her. But these are important kingdom assignments right there.
Mm-hmm.
And so anyway, I'm excited about the younger generation. I'll give you a historic example. In 1972, I was a part of the group of Jim Wallace and Ron Sider and others called Evangelicals for McGovern. And, we got a lot of flack for that. And I ran ads in the paper, and the Calvin fundraisers had a little hard time because I was on the Calvin faculty. But McGovern gave an address at Wheaton College to the student body. And Tom Skinner, the black evangelist, introduced him.
Hmm.
And Tom Skinner quoted Isaiah, good news for the poor. And he said, I am going to vote for George McGovern because he speaks of justice in a way that the other candidate doesn't. You know? And the whole student body at Wheaton College booed him.
Oh,
Horrible moment. Yeah.
wow.
Well, many decades later, a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, I was at Wheaton with John Perkins.
Yeah, sure.
John Perkins, we each gave chapel talks, but John Perkins gave a talk to the student body at Wheaton on the importance of racial justice. And he got a 3-minute standing ovation.
Hmm.
You know? And there were young people who came up to me and said, yeah, I think this chapel changed my life. You know? But the difference between 1972 and 1918, 1919, you know, was a big difference. And I'm encouraged by this. I think there's some young people who they want to argue with their parents, but they want to do it in a loving sort of way.
Hmm.
And very often they say they talk to their parents about Jesus. They're Christian parents, you know. They talk to them about Jesus. So I'm encouraged by that. I mean, I'm encouraged by I'm encouraged by gender issues. I was interviewed by Christianity Today recently about something, and they said, "What do you think of Christianity Today right now?" And I said, 6 years ago, women writers at Christianity Today were part of some women's group that were writing mainly to women. If you look at any recent issue of Christianity Today, the women are writing for the whole audience, for men and women. And they're not just writing about gender issues. They found a voice dealing with issues of family, but also issues of justice, of the global church, wonderful things. And I'm encouraged by that. That's the premier evangelical magazine has really just gotten to a point where it's celebrating the gifts of women, and not just feminine gifts, but just human gifts that they have. I'm encouraged by what I think we've been doing this course at our church on how to deal with difficult people that you disagree with on political matters.
I don't know any people like that.
Really, we've discovered that we had about 100 people sign up for it, and they're really interested in learning some things about this. And I think that that there's some new things. And one of the things that most work got through to people on this is don't just, let's say you're a Kamala Harris supporter, and you're having a very hard time with Trump supporters, Well, don't just treat that Trump supporter as a Trump supporter, I get a lot of good theology from lines of hymns. The Christmas Carol line that goes like this: "The hopes and fears of all the years are met in thee, O little town of Bethlehem." And that we are people who are motivated by hopes and fears. And the Trump supporter and the Kamala Harris supporter, they bring hopes and fears to their political lives. And very often it's grief, it's anger, a sense of loss, I used to see, even the idea of a Christian America. They have taken away my country, and I do not know where they've laid it. A sense of loss. And if we're going to talk about things, we need to begin there rather than with, why'd you vote for Trump? Or why'd you vote for her? Why are you going to vote for her? But rather, tell me about how did you get interested in politics? And what are some of the things that, I've learned this from Young Life. Young Life says, if you want to know what a 15-year-old girl believes about God, don't say, what do you believe about God? Ask her, what do your friends believe about God? Because once you say, what do you believe? She's put on the spot. She's going to have to defend her person in this. But if you say, what do your friends believe about God? She can relax a little and be an amateur sociologist or psychologist, amateur theologian. But you're going to learn what she believes about God.
Yeah.
And so if you're dealing with a person that, let's say you're a Kamala Harris person and you're talking to a MAGA person, say, help me understand this. What are your friends who vote for Trump? What is it about him that really speaks to their hearts? And you're going to get at issues that are very different than why'd you vote for him? And I really think that we need to get to that level of hopes and fears.
Yeah.
Yearnings, things in my history, my pilgrimage that I'm really upset about. But I'm upset about because I felt a sense of loss, or I'm angry with my son.
Yeah, I think that's just an incredible way to find the common ground. Because we really do all have hopes and dreams, and we have losses that are influencing on such deep levels. Yeah. So I think that's a wonderful place to finish up today. Rich, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I really appreciate you. You are such a gift and just such a encouragement. So thank you so much for sharing your stories and sharing a bit about your work.
Yeah. Thank you for what you're doing. I appreciate your ministry and that you're reaching out through these kinds of conversations. Bless you.
Of course. Thank you so much.
Okay.
All right, Rich.
Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Take care.
God bless.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of the Faith Informing Podcast. My prayer today, as you reflect on my conversation with Rich Mouw, is that you would find ways to engage your neighbors who think differently than you, who vote differently than you, who are different. I pray that you'd be able to engage them because they are part of the image of God. And when you meet them, you are going to learn new things about God. It's not just about who they are, but it's also about who God is. I encourage you this week to think about what Rich said, that we all have hopes and dreams, fears and losses that affect the way we think politically. Who is one person in your life that you'd like to have a deeper relationship with, but politics is getting in the way? How can some of Rich's questions help you to engage that person? Well, until next time, take good care.